Chapter 17 of Paul the Dauntless. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Leeson. Paul the Dauntless by Basil Joseph Mathews. Chapter 17. Finding a Son. Some days later, as Paul was talking to Barnabas, he said, "Come, Barnabas, let us go back and visit the brothers in every town where we have proclaimed the word. Let us see how they are doing." Barnabas said, "Yes, I agree. Who shall we take with us? I suggest my nephew, young John Mark." Paul frowned at this. "I do not want," he said, "to have as our helper the man who turned back and shirked the dangers of carrying the message when we were in Pamphylia." It would not be easy for Paul to avoid hurting Barnabas's feelings in telling him that his nephew, John Mark, had not the spirit of courage and the sturdiness needed in men who must be ready to risk their lives at any hour and take a stoning or a beating without flinching. Indeed, it is likely that Paul's quick temper would lead him to say this abruptly. Barnabas maybe thought that John Mark ought to have a second chance, but Paul would not take the risk. We can see that he was right in thinking that they must not have a man with them who would fail at a pinch. In any case, what Paul said made Barnabas so angry that he would have nothing more to do with his old friend. Barnabas took his kinsman, young John Mark, and went off on a missionary journey to his native place, Cyprus, leaving Paul in Antioch. It cut Paul to the quick to part from the great comrade of his first journey. He and Barnabas had faced stoning, fever and robbers together, and had shared the perils of river and road and sea. But Paul knew that he was on a great enterprise, where any man was unfit who, like John Mark, quailed before death or feared to take any adventure that might come to him. Paul never thought of himself as a hero. He only knew that he cared so much for the carrying out of God's great aim that he forgot his own safety. So Paul could claim rightly, "I prove myself at all points a true servant to God, by great endurance, by suffering, by troubles, by calamities, by lashes, by imprisonment, mobbed, toiling, sleepless, starving." So even for the love of Barnabas his comrade, he could not take with him a man like John Mark, whom he believed to be unready to face all these things. Barnabas, therefore, all sore and angry in spirit, went down with John Mark to the port at Seleucia to set sail westward. We do not hear that Paul and Barnabas ever met again. Paul went to ask the friend with whom he had many talks on their way up from the council at Jerusalem, Silas, whether he would go out on the long perilous journey over the mountains to the people of the plateau. He, like Paul, though a Jew, was a Roman citizen. His full Roman name was Silvanus, but his friends called him Silas for short. Paul wanted Silas to go with him across the Taurus mountains to the Roman cities of Derbe and Lystra, Iconium and Antioch. Silas would be a great help to Paul there, not only because he was a Roman Jew, but because he had been at the Jerusalem Council, where they had decided on the message to the nations. The strict Christian Jews in these Roman cities of the province of Galatia might say that Paul was a crank without any authority to tell the nations they might come into the fellowship without circumcision. But they would find it difficult to say such things to Silas, who came from the church at Jerusalem itself carrying a letter signed by James. Paul and his new friend Silas started out northward. A little band of the brethren came to give them a send-off. The flush of sunrise was reflected in the Orontes on their right as they crossed the bridge which carried them out to the northern plain. They had a long camping journey of many weeks ahead of them, in which they must be ready to wade across streams, skirt lakes, climb great mountain passes, and trudge over wide plains. They would probably take asses with them, who would carry, in saddlebags slung across their backs, water bottles, their oil and cheese and olives for the midday meal, an iron crock for cooking their dish of corn and meat at night, their hooded cloaks for shelter from the rain or mountain snow, and for sleeping in at night. Sometimes they joined a company of traders, who travelled along the road together for defence against the robbers. They would take special care to do this when they began to climb from the great plain, round the curving roads among the brown hills, and up into the brigand-infested ravines of the mountains that divided Syria, the province in which Damascus and Antioch lay, from Cilicia, the province of Paul's own boyhood, where Tarsus stood. Paul and Silas talked as they rode along or walked by the side of the asses. Paul was very proud of his native city, toward which they were travelling. He would be sure to tell Silas stories of his life when he was a boy in Tarsus there. He could, as they came to rest in the evening at one of the caravan centres, point to black low tents stretched around them on the camping ground, made of the famous Tarsian goat's hair cloth. The cloth was known all over the Roman Empire as Cilicium, because it came from this Cilician plain on which Paul was born. Silas knew that Paul had been trained as a tent maker. Paul could tell him, "I intend to earn my living at my trade whenever I stay in a city to preach. In that way I shall stop men from saying that I follow Christ just to get a livelihood." We can be certain that Silas and he would discuss the quarrel with Barnabas, and they would wish that there were some younger man like John Mark, only braver, with them as a helper. "There is a young fellow in Lystra over the mountains," Paul might say, "named Timothy, i.e., fear God. He became a disciple of Jesus Christ when I was there. His father is a Greek and his mother a Jewess. I believe he would make a fine helper in place of John Mark." Talking in this way they came down among the towns in the Cilician plain where Paul preached and taught in these quiet years before Barnabas came to fetch him to Antioch. As Paul came through the streets of these towns in Cilicia, the faces of the Christian people, cobbling and baking in their little shops, lighted up with gladness when they saw their old friend come back. They would run and bring together the other brethren who lived in the town, and they would listen eagerly to Paul who had, years before, by his teaching brought them into the new and splendid fellowship. We are not told what he said to them, but without doubt he would say simple, straight words like these which he wrote to his friends: "My brothers, whom I love and have longed to see, stand fast. I wish greatly that your love may grow more and more in knowledge and in all judgment, so that you may be keen on the things that are really good." Then those two splendid sentences that might be the command of a commander to his armies: "Stand fast together in one spirit, with one mind, working hard together for the faith of the good news." Do not be at all terrified by your enemies. You are to have the gift of going through hard times on behalf of Christ, fighting battles like those through which I have gone. "Do all your work," he went on, "without muttering and disputing with one another, so that you may not be open to blame and may do harm to no one. Live like sons of God among a crooked-minded and contrary nation, shining in the midst of them like lights in the world, holding out as a torch the word of life." In many of these places the same hard question came up, the Jews declaring that everybody must come under the law and the others saying no. It was a great help to them when Silas brought out his parchment and read aloud the letter that said they were not to have this burden laid upon them. At last they came out on the bank of the river Cydnus and reached the great city of Tarsus. Paul's father and mother must have been very old by this time, if indeed they had not died. Some of his old schoolmates would not speak to him. They had grown to be strict Pharisees who would have nothing to do with Paul since he had become a Christian. But others, who had been led by him into the blithe joy of being worshippers of God through Christ, would have plucked their very eyes out to give to him, if he had needed them. But he and Silas could not rest long even here. In front of them rose the high ridge of the Taurus, and on the other side of the snows of the mountains was the great plateau of the Roman cities. The asses were brought out and a supply of food placed in the saddlebags. For they must prepare for days of trudging up lonely defiles where no villages stood, nor any place of rest save the solitary roadside inn by the rushing stream, with its dark low stable and rough bare room. They rode out of the city by the northern gate. The hoofs of the asses clattered on the paved Roman road that ran straight ahead of them. They could see its distant lengths shining in the sunlight up past the Hill of the Seven Sleepers. They went through the suburb among the hills, where Paul and his father and mother and sister used to come in the summer months when all the plain lay baked under the fierce, sultry heat of the sun. At length the last house of the distant Tarsus suburb lay behind Paul and Silas. Before them the road curved like a serpent among the hills by the side of the stream. It was still the great paved Roman road, for this was the way along which the legions marched and the imperial post galloped. Among the hills by the roadside the spring anemones bloomed, but as they climbed higher, along the side of the rushing torrent of icy snow water, no flowers bloomed. Further on they stopped to take their olives and cheese and bread, where the grey old sycamores clung with their gnarled roots to the rocks that were greyer and older than the trees, while up above on the steep craggy peaks the dark green pine trees moaned in the wind. The sound of the tinkle and boom of bells came on them. Round the curve of the rocky road a camel came. On his neck were little copper bells that gave a tinkling sound, and from his side hung larger ones that sounded deeper tones as the camel strode silently down the pass. Behind him another camel came, and another and another. 8, all linked together by light chains, and the first and the last wore bells, so that the camel-man who rode in front on a little donkey knew, if the bells in the distance ceased to sound, that the chain had broken and some of his camels were left behind. The sun went behind the rocks. As the late afternoon wore on, Paul and Silas came to a square low building, just 4 windowless stone walls without, and within a quadrangle in which they could stable the asses and find a corner by the wood fire where they could wrap themselves in their cloaks and sleep. Outside the inn they saw the camels in groups, all in circles with tails outward and heads down in the centre, eating the corn that their driver had thrown down. A new string of camels came in, and slowly squatting down, grunted discontentedly while their driver unlashed the burdens from their backs. As night fell, Paul and Silas, having gathered together twigs and pieces of wood, lighted a fire under their crock and boiled a dish of wheat and oil and spices. Other fires crackled all round the encampment. The flames threw wild leaping shadows of the sleeping camels against the wall of the inn. Then a camel driver started to sing a long ballad story in many short verses. Many of the verses were so foul and unclean that Paul and Silas were glad to wrap their cloaks around their ears and lie down to sleep. Before the morning sun had even caught the snow crest of the Taurus in its loop of flame, Paul and Silas were up and, having washed in the running water of the stream, were away on the road again. As they climbed higher up the profound gorge, which was filled from depth to height with the sound of running waters and the tinkle of camel bells, the dizzy, grey crags soared higher and higher on either side. Then they came to a place where it seemed as though they must turn back, for, right across the road, towering 600 feet above them, lay the crowning ridge of the mountain range. They could neither climb nor go round, yet the road lay straight on, as though into the very heart of the Taurus rocks. Paul and Silas trudged on, and the narrowest pass in the world opened before them. There ran the road, so straight that a laden camel brushed the grey rocks with his burden, and by the road the swift mountain torrent ran. From the road and the river the 2 precipices soared up and up, as though defying the very skies, hundreds upon hundreds of feet of grey, defiant, glorious rock echoing with the music of the stream. They went on into the shadow of this deep ravine, the Cilician Gates. We do not know whether they remembered that Alexander the Great with all his armies had poured through that narrow defile. Certainly Paul would have laughed if Silas had said to him, what was perfectly true, that in that ravine at that moment, in the cloak of a travelling Jew, with hands stained and rough with the toil of tent making, with limbs toughened and with muscle taut with the travail of much journeying, stood a man greater than Alexander himself. For Paul was mightier in his real power, swifter and more daring in brain than even Alexander, as brave and reckless of danger in action, and destined to have an effect on the future history of the world far wider and deeper. For Paul took up the standard of an empire that was to cover more races than even Alexander ever saw, and he dared to fight his life's campaign, not at the head of an army, but almost alone, in the power of an invisible and risen King. Yes, without cheer of mother or of daughter, yes, without stay of father or of son, lone on the land and homeless on the water, pass I in patience till the work is done. Yet not in solitude if Christ anear me, waken him workers for the great employ. Nay, not in solitude if those that hear me catch from my joyaunce the surprise of joy. So Paul and Silas passed through the straight and narrow gate out into the sunshine of the high plateau. They rode among the hills in a broad valley with no ravine, and then dropped to the plain which ran for hundreds of miles at a level of some 3,000 or 4,000 feet above the level of the sea. They were now in the kingdom of Antiochus, who held rule in allegiance to Rome. They did not stop at any cities in this kingdom, but pressed on with all speed to the frontier city of the Lycaonian part of the province of Galatia, Derbe. Paul came into Derbe, as you will see from the map, at the east gate in place of the west which he had entered, coming from Lystra, on his earlier journey with Barnabas. To the Christians there he and Silas read and explained the letter from Jerusalem and spoke to the people, encouraging them. From Derbe they hastened on westward along the Roman road. It may well be that Paul would tell Silas how he had come from Lystra along that road, all bruised with the cruel stones of the mob, who had been egged on by the angry Jews. At length they came in sight of Lystra with the sun setting behind the great temple of Jupiter, whose priests, we remember, had started to sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas as Mercury and Jupiter. " Here is Timothy," said Paul to Silas, as a young fellow hurried to greet them, his eyes all shining with joy at seeing his great hero Paul back again in Lystra. Silas would see from Timothy's hair and from the colour of his eyes and his skin that he was not a pure-blooded Jew. When they went to Timothy's he found that Timothy's father was a Greek, and his mother, named Eunice, was a Jewess. In the house with them lived his grandmother, named Lois. If Timothy was excited when he saw Paul come back into Lystra, he would hardly hold himself for joy and surprise when Paul put to him the question, " Will you come with me on my journey carrying the good news of the love of God as shown in Jesus Christ? " We can imagine how Timothy would cry, " Oh yes, of all the things in the world that I most desire," when Paul would quietly interrupt him and tell him how John Mark had turned back in fear. " This is no easy thing," he would tell Timothy. " We must be ready to face weariness and pain, hunger and thirst and cold, storm and brigands, stoning and beatings, imprisonment and the fear of death." But as he looked into the face of Timothy and saw all his brave spirit looking at him with love and worship, eager to dare any danger if he might only be with his master Paul, he could not hesitate, but gave the word that Timothy was to travel with them on the new adventure into lands that none of them had ever seen. Chapter 18